Mitro, hello and welcome to my show. Friends, time doesn't dilute the scars of hateful crimes. I am talking of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre perpetrated by Brigadier General Reginald Dyer. People who died in that slaughter, I'm sure, must be turning in their graves on each anniversary of the crime that was unleashed on April 13, 1919 by this devil. And with that logic, the victims by now must have turned at least 100 times in their proverbial grave. But the apology from the British government is yet to come. This monster, Brigadier Dyer, later died on 23rd July 1927. Winston Churchill called him a rotten apple simply to disavow his responsibility, but then the rotten apple grew in his own backyard colony called India. General Dyer is also called the Butcher of Amritsar because of his order to fire repeatedly on a crowd of peaceful protesters. This resulted in the murder of at least 500 to 600 people and injuries to over 1,000 more. Subsequently, Dyer was removed from duty and widely condemned both in Britain and India. But he became a celebrated hero among some of the British connections and the British Raj. Some historians argue the episode was a decisive event towards the end of the British rule in India. Many books have been written on this particular massacre, latest being Jallianwala Bagh, an empire of fear, and the making of the Amritsar Massacre by historian Kim A. Wagner. Wagner teaches the history of colonial India and the British Empire at Queen Mary University of London. He has written extensively on the subject of Thugee, the Indian uprising of 1857, and resistance and colonial violence more generally in 19th and 20th century global history. The book has been published by Penguin and the price is a little below rupees 500 as seen in Amazon. Even though it has been a century since Brigadier General Reginald Dyer ordered Indian Army troops to open fire upon an unarmed crowd at Jallianwala Bagh on April 13, 1919, the memory of it is still painful for Indians. British historian Kim Wagner has taken a fresh look at the incident in this particular book. There are some advanced praises, about the book. Let me just read out two of them to you. One, in the cautionary tale provided in Jallianwala Bagh, it is enduring racist fear that lies at the heart of precipitate violence. Analytically sharp but gripping to read, the book is page turner, says Barbara D. Metcalf, co-author of A Concise History of India. The second one is, in the compelling yet exacting study, Kim Wagner combines the intimacy of the storyteller and the distance of the historian to evoke the microhistory of the massacre while understanding it as the final stage of the much longer process. Stretching back to Sepoy uprising, mining a variety of resources, diaries, memoirs, and court testimonies, he uncovers fresh perspectives and examines the relation between colonial panic and state brutality. With sophistication, sincerity, and style rare in published accounts of this much trodden ground. This particular praise is from Shantanu Das, author of India Empire and First War Culture. The book gives a good overview of the massacre from all corners and all stakeholders. Was Jallianwala Bagh massacre one-off incident as portrayed back then and even today by many? The book tries to answer that. The author feels rather than being an unprecedented event, the Amritsar massacre revealed the racialized logic of a colonial violence, and we find the exact same sentiments expressed by British officers involved in the suppression of the Indian uprising of 1857, for instance. An apology that describes General Dyer as a rotten apple, which is essentially what Winston Churchill said in 1920, is not an apology at all, but rather an attempt to disavow any form of responsibility in terms of the Raj and the British Empire in general. There is often a debate about the troops who opened fire. Some say they were Gorkhas and Pathan troops. The author, with his research, tries to clear the air when he says there probably were a few Sikh troops also present, but we have to remember that the British at the same time did not think of the local population in communal terms. Dyer refers to the protesters simply as rebels. The composition of the force he took with him to Jallianwala Bagh was largely accidental and it was not planned. To a question about Indian Army veterans who had served in World War I being among the unfortunate crowd that got killed and injured, the eyewitnesses described how veterans called out for people to lie down to avoid being shot. So there were clearly demobilized soldiers in the crowd. British Empire apologists often dismiss the Indian National Congress's findings about the tragedy and settle for government estimates to save their own skin. The Indian National Congress actually estimated that 500 had been killed, but that 1,000 might not be an exaggerated estimate based on the the door-to-door inquiry made by local charities. Some 540 names were found, and the author feels that somewhere between 500 to 600 were killed, and perhaps 3 times that many wounded. As per the book, it was not a premeditated plan. Dyer believed he was entering a war zone and was fully prepared to shoot at anyone who defied his ban on public meetings. He did not know what the layout of the city of or Jallianwala Bagh was. Once he arrived at the Bagh, he did not care much about who actually was present, but simply opened fire without using his brains. There is no evidence that 120 bodies were recovered from the well. Eyewitnesses describe 1 or 2 people falling in it, and Motilal Nehru and Madan Mohan Malviya thought they saw 1 or 2 bodies floating in the well. Later that summer, which was nothing more than a clay pot and some old clothes floating in the well. So people were not very clear then. There was a merging of the canal feeding with the holy tank, which runs under Jallianwala Bagh, since we know that some people climbed into that to flee the bullets, and that several bodies were later recovered. Lastly, Churchill denounced Dyer in 1920, but it was not because he found indiscriminate violence in the empire unacceptable, but rather because Dyer's actions made it so difficult to defend British rule in India. That is also why he was eager to depict Dyer and the massacre as un-British. Friends, imagine had this tragedy taken place in today's world, things would have been so different with so much of media attention. And that time we did not have any media attention. The massacre has been portrayed in several movies, starting from Attenborough's Gandhi, but author Kim Wagner thinks none of them make more impact than reenact the set of visual troops first deployed by Attenborough. There is almost a checklist of recurrent motifs, including Dyer ordering his troops to fire and people throwing themselves into the well or getting crushed against a lock gate. Crying kids sitting next to their dead parents. To break new ground in this respect would require a break from these filmic conventions. Jallianwala Bagh is often the least talked about episode in the British circles, but yes, to an extent, or rather quite an extent, during the trial it helped in understanding the British colonial policy. The Hunter Commission was set up partly to assuage moderate Indian nationalists, and Montagu, the Secretary of the State of India, State for India, never expected it to reveal the things it did. The fact that this was such a large inquiry which elicited so much evidence, not least Dyer's own testimony, means that this was probably the best recorded colonial atrocity within the British Empire up till that point. So that's the point I was making. Had this tragedy taken anywhere in any part of the world today, all this thing would have been obviated, and people would have had the correct scenario from the word go. Well, if you are interested in history and the sad chapters of Indian history, this book is for you. Well written and great detailing and large, unbiased, barring certain chapters where you get some eerie feeling. It sails through the Indian Ocean without turbulence. A historian's prime job is to lay down his history in proper perspective, where the author, I think, has not failed. I would give the book 7 out of 10. So friends, that's all I have for today. If you liked my show, kindly share it. Also press the like icon. Also subscribe our channel by pressing the red icon, and don't forget to press the bell so that you're notified each time we upload a video. And for now, goodbye and see you soon.